One of the noteworthy characteristics of the Jewish way of life and worship is the emphasis on ceremony and actions that convey symbolic meaning. You probably won't find any other manifestation in culture that is more symbolic, I think, than the Jewish culture. And certainly that is the case when it comes to things like the Moedim, which is translated more commonly as feasts, but literally means the appointed times of God. And they, if you've observed the feast with us, you realize how powerfully they convey biblical concepts in symbolic ways that you don't get necessarily in just more of a principle-based, dialogue. But this emphasis on ceremonial communication is not just limited to holy days. There are other special life cycle events within the Jewish culture that are very meaningful. And certainly that's true, like in any culture, when it comes to times when people get married or when somebody dies, that you have a significant life cycle moment. But Judaism is somewhat unique in that it has additional life cycle moments, especially at the beginning of one's life, rites of passage, if you will. And so for boys, that means having a Brit Milah, translated as circumcision, at the age of 8 days. Many Jewish boys become, as we say, bar mitzvah. It's actually a misnomer to say that you had your bar mitzvah. It's like if you turn it into a noun. That's not good Hebrew. It literally means son of commandment. You become a son of commandment, and in the sense of following through on one particular commandment that is emblematic about taking upon all of God's commandments. So that's the more accurate rendering of that. And that's a marker of entering into adulthood at the age of 13. And in recent years, there have been many congregations that have started doing the same thing for girls. Now, it's not a biblical concept, but it is one that has been an adaptation within Judaism. And so that's called a bat mitzvah. And that usually occurs at the age of either 12 or 13. In recent years, we've seen this transformation within the culture. But there's something else beyond these very familiar ceremonies that I want to talk about today. It's not widely known, but it is as biblically significant as all these that I just mentioned here. It is called in the Hebrew Pidyon Haben. Pidyon Haben literally means the redemption of a son. But it is used in reference to the redemption of the firstborn son. Okay, so it's not just for all male boys, the very first one here. And so that's why you'll typically see it translated as redemption of the firstborn, even though it literally is not what it is saying here. Its observance has its origin in the Bible, and it is part of this week's parashah, or the weekly reading of the Torah portions. And the passage is found in the book of Numbers, chapter 18. So if you have your Bible, wherever you might be, you can turn there. We'll also have it on the screen, of course. This portion in Numbers chapter 18 begins with God's description of the responsibilities of Aaron, who was the first high priest of Israel, and his sons who served as priests under him. So let's go ahead and take a look at this passage. Verse 1 of Numbers 18 says, Adonai said to Aaron, you and your sons and your father's household with you shall bear the guilt in connection with the sanctuary. And you and your sons with you shall bear the guilt in connection with your priesthood. He's just simply saying here that the important work of atoning for the guilt of sinful humanity, sinful Israelites, would be borne by Aaron and his sons. They would take it upon themselves, not in the sense of the sin being put upon them, but they would bear the responsibility of doing the atonement. That's all it's getting at here. And so this is a key biblical concept. If you do not understand the concept of substitutionary atonement, where a substitute dies in the place of the guilty party, and that it is carried out by a mediator, someone else, not yourself. If you do not understand that, you will not understand anything that follows in the rest of the Bible. You will not understand why Yeshua had to come to this earth and what Yeshua actually accomplished if you do not understand that principle. And it's all brought out right here in this manner. God is just saying to Aaron and your sons, it's on you to take care of the rest of the people. And it'll be an act of atonement that you will be doing, which requires then a substitute. So the irony is that the guilty person does everything to get into trouble initially and then has no way out on their own. There is no way for that person to be relieved of the consequences. There has to be reliance on a priest as a mediator between God and humanity in order to restore a person who sins. This is fundamental Bible doctrine 101. We have to understand this in order for us now to understand what God is doing throughout the rest of Scripture. And this is what he's declaring here very fundamentally. And by the way, this is a concept that he has never annulled. See, that's an important kind of thing. If God says, no, this no longer applies, he would tell you so, but he has not done that. And so we then have to acknowledge that this is a foundational biblical principle that carries forth throughout all of time up until our present day. This is not just a moment in history that applies to that day in Numbers chapter 18, when the people are moving about in the wilderness wanderings. It applies to today as well. Okay, Adonai then goes on to say this in verse 6. Behold, I myself have taken your fellow Levites from among the sons of Israel. They are a gift to you, dedicated to Adonai to perform the service for the tent of meeting. But you and your sons with you shall attend to your priesthood for everything concerning the altar and inside the veil, and you are to perform service. I am giving you the priesthood as a bestowed service, but the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. So now we're seeing the serious nature of the role of the priest. Not only is it the only way for the benefit of the people, but there's a danger if you yourself try to engage in the atoning act. You see, not only is God saying that it's the only way, he's saying there will be consequences if you do not do it my way. You cannot do it on your own. And so that should immediately tell us that any attempts at atonement in our modern time, in which you do good deeds, give to charity, say whatever kind of religious ritual, liturgy, any kind of acts that are man-based, they will not work. And in this day, there were very severe consequences of that. He's saying here that only the sons of Levi could serve as the mediators in worship. Now, according to the next verse, along with this responsibility comes a blessing from God. Then Adonai spoke to Aaron, now behold, I myself have given you charge of my offerings, even all the holy gifts of the sons of Israel. I have given them to you as a portion, and to your sons as a perpetual atonement. This shall be yours from the most holy gifts reserved from the fire. Every offering of theirs, even every grain offering and every sin offering and every guilt offering, which they shall render to me, shall be most holy for you and your sons. So when you study the actual offerings, as we have done in our Parsha study, looked at them very carefully and how that they were to be done, you can see how in most cases, a portion of the sacrifice was offered up to God as a as something that would be burned and the savory aroma would lift up to him. But a portion was left for the priests to eat. It was how they received their food. And so this is similar to the way that people who serve in ministry today are dependent upon God's people from the general believing community to provide for their needs. Okay, so now we'll go down to verse 12. It goes on, it's not just the offerings that are being offered. He says, all the best of the fresh oil and the best of the fresh wine and of the grain, the first fruits of those which they gave to Adonai, I give them to you. Isn't that interesting? The first ripe fruits that are in their land, which they bring to Adonai, shall be yours. Every one of your household who is clean may eat it. Every devoted thing in Israel shall be yours. Every first issue of the womb of all flesh, whether man or animal, which they offer to Adonai, shall be yours. So now at this point, you should be able to see here a recurring theme. I highlighted that for you here. God was giving these things to the Levites. He declared they shall be yours. And the reason that he could do that is that all of these things ultimately belong to him, and he's free to do with them in any way he sees fit. That is consistent with what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago when I showed the connection between God's sovereignty and the dirt of this earth and the humanity that was derived from that dirt and walks upon it. He can do with the dirt whatever he wants. He can do with the produce that comes out of the dirt any way he wants. And what he has decreed is, it shall go to the priests. But notice, it's not just, any portion. It's the first ripe fruits. It's the choicest items, the fresh wine and of the grain, the best of everything should go to Adonai by way of the priests. And that includes all living beings. Now, this is the part where you might think, I can see by having some really, nice fruit or some wine and being able to enjoy that. How do I enjoy the first issue of the womb of all flesh, a man or an animal? Okay. Basically, what he's decreeing here, that the firstborn of all animals would be used for sacrifices. And the firstborn of all humanity would be used for the administration of those sacrifices or to serve in the priesthood. So the key here is to understand that all firstborn sons would be responsible for serving Adonai in worship. In other words, according to this principle, all firstborn sons of Israel should have been priests. In fact, that is exactly what God declared in Exodus 13:2. I won't show it to you here, but on the night when the Passover occurred and the people departed from Egypt, he declared that all firstborn sons were to be sanctified or set apart for serving Adonai. But you see, there was a real problem with that reality, because a short time later, after they had departed from Egypt, they go down to Mount Sinai, where Moses receives the Torah. We're told how all the people from the tribes of Israel, with the exception of the tribe of Levi, engaged in the worship of the golden calf. So they participated in a great sin. And as a result, the privilege of serving Adonai was taken away from all of the other tribes, especially the firstborn sons who were supposed to become priests. That was taken away from them, and it was given to the only tribe that remained faithful in that great time of testing, which was the Levites. So God decreed in Numbers chapter 3 that the Levites would take the place of all firstborn sons from throughout the other tribes. So the reason behind the concept then of the Levitical priesthood that we see in Scripture that continues on now all the way to the end of the Bible is that they were designated by God to be substitutes for the firstborn sons of Israel. The firstborn sons should have been the priests, but they lost that privilege due to sin. So then when we consider the greater context of Scripture, we can see how God administrates this. Now, of course, we need to recognize that God is a God of justice. He is a God who practices law in the sense of being truly legal, truly just. He does everything by the book in terms of how he administrates things. And so he does things like he institutes covenants, which were basically a form of legal documents that were used in the ancient Near East. He follows that format just precisely. Likewise, in the Torah, the system of justice for daily living followed the concept of equity, meaning that the consequences were to be commensurate with the actual violation, the degree of harm, and it had to take into account intent. So it was very judicious. It was very legal in what he did. The same is true here in this transferring of the responsibility to serve as priests from the firstborn sons to the Levites is a legal transaction. Okay, so verse 15 goes on to say, nevertheless, the firstborn of man you shall surely redeem, and the firstborn of unclean animals you shall redeem. As to their redemption price, from a month old you shall redeem them by your valuation, 5 shekels of silver, according to the shekel of the sanctuary, which is 20 gerahs. Well, that's a measurement of how much silver was in there. So this tells us that the parents of Israel were required to redeem their firstborn sons, or to buy back their firstborn sons, because technically they belonged to God. See, God says they all belong to me, but they could buy them back to their families. Very clever idea the Lord came up with here. He does pretty good at those things, I think you'll agree. And so that's the way that things were done for centuries, throughout all of the history of Israel, throughout the time that the tabernacle stood and the 2 temples that stood there in Jerusalem. The Levites, who descended from Aaron, served in place of all the firstborn sons of Israel at the cost of 5 silver shekels. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that not only brought an end to Levitical worship, but the end of the Levitical priesthood. No descendant of Aaron has ever served Adonai as a priest again. Why is that so? Well, the simple answer is that God provided a better way than Levitical sacrifice for providing for the atonement of the sins of humanity. That's the way of Yeshua. It's a better way. I got to tell you, Yeshua is the better way. The entire book of Hebrews is based on that concept. As the only one who was fully human and yet fully divine, and as the only one who never sinned, nor had a sin nature, and as the one who was willing to lay down his life as the sacrificial substitute for all people, he fulfilled every aspect of Levitical sacrifice. So you can see from God's economy, there was no need for it to continue on in the old way. Every last atoning sacrifice was fulfilled through Yeshua. And so as the book of Hebrews points out, Levitical sacrifice became obsolete. The better way had come. So we are told there in the book of Hebrews that he died once for all. It is undeniably then no coincidence that the temple was destroyed a short time after Yeshua's death. I believe that if you are really honest with yourself, and you're part of rabbinical Judaism today, or you're just a secular Jewish person, you need to be really honest in acknowledging the fact that why did God let the temple be destroyed? Why did he allow all the priesthood to be dispersed? If it was such a holy thing, such a necessary thing, would he not have found a way to have preserved it? You have to be honest about the way that God operates in this world. If he comes up with a better way, there's no need for the older way that had its flaws. So with the end of the need for a Levitical priesthood meant there would be the end of the need for the redemption of the firstborn. The role of priestly mediators no longer needed to be transferred to the Levites. Now, that does not mean that a mediator is no longer needed. Not at all, because like I said, God never rescinded that principle. He just provided a better mediator in Yeshua. See, unfortunately, not everybody believes that as being true. So rabbinical Judaism is left with trying to figure out what to do without a temple as a place of worship and a priesthood as the ones who carry out worship. How do you do what God is requiring? And that's where all the rabbinical commentaries come in down through the centuries. Rather than saying, did God do something better here? And rather than just trying to patch it back together as has been done. Well, as a result, along with a number of other practices in Judaism, the relic of the biblical practice of Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn, carries on today, especially among the Haredim, or the ultra-Orthodox. So I'm going to show you some pictures that actually depict how this is done today. We can see in some of these contemporary scenes that the basic elements of the custom remain the same. It only applies to firstborn sons. In keeping with the instruction in the last verse I read from Numbers 18:16, it occurs when the child is 1 month old. The parents will then bring the child to someone who claimed to have a lineage to being a Kohen or a priest. The father will then attest before the Kohen that the child is the firstborn son of the mother. The Kohen will then ask the father, would you rather have the child or 5 silver coins? Now, at that moment, it's probably not good to hesitate. But the protocol is always to declare a preference for the child, which I think you can relate to. The father then recites 2 blessings and pays 5 silver coins to the Kohen. These coins are rather interesting. They're very unique to the concept of Pidyon Haben. They are not legal tender. Yeah, you can see there's Hamsa signs and a really interesting 5-candle menorah and fishes in that one there. But you know, there's a whole number of these forms that are out there. And in some cases, the Kohen returns the coins to the family when it is over as a commemoration of the occasion. And so you'll see how they will do that. So it becomes a keepsake for the family. But you can see how it's very ceremonial in nature without actually fulfilling the original purpose of the transaction, transferring the right to serve as a priest, because there's no priesthood for them to function in and no temple for them to serve at. So having this background understanding of the practice of redeeming firstborn sons helps us to understand what took place in the days of Yeshua, in the actual life of Yeshua, right after his birth. Luke chapter 2 describes how Yeshua was circumcised on the 8th day. He had his Brit Milah. So the parents just followed right along with the instructions of the Torah. But then there's more if you read in Luke chapter 2, because it goes on to describe what happened when he reached the age of 1 month. We're told in Luke 2:22, when the days for their purification, according to the law of Moses, the Torah, were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. Why did they have to do this in Jerusalem? Because that's where a priest was. They were serving at the temple. To present him to the Lord, where would you present him to the Lord? At the temple. As it is written in the Torah, in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. That is a direct quote of Exodus chapter 13, verse 2, that I mentioned earlier about the principle of firstborn sons being sanctified, set apart, and belonging to the Lord. So this is clearly a description of Yeshua being redeemed as a firstborn son according to the manner given in Numbers chapter 18. It does not state here that Joseph and Mary paid 5 silver coins in this transaction. But that is something that they undoubtedly did because that's what everybody did in those days. It was the obligation for all families based on the Torah. So I have 100% assurance that that's what they did. So what we can see here is that the life of Yeshua began in compliance with the Torah, and the rest of the Gospels confirm that Yeshua was always Torah observant. He was raised from the very moment to be faithful to what God had already declared. Now, I've read a number of teachings on this particular story in Luke chapter 2, and some people say that a righteous man named Simeon fulfilled the role of the Cohen on this day in Luke chapter 2. But there is nothing in the text to indicate that. He does come on the scene and he sees the child and so on, but there's nothing in the language that suggests that he was the actual priest. The likelihood is that they would have gone to the temple and connected with a priest there, paid the 5 coins, done the blessings, just like all their other parents did. I wanted to share this with you to see, so that you can see the significance of the Torah in Yeshua's life. We know, as we can start to consider then the details around this, that Yeshua was born from the tribe of Judah. We see that in his genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. Now that, of course, was the tribe from which the kings of Israel descended, and thus entitled him to be the ultimate king of Israel. I mean, that's his pedigree. So like all the tribes except Levi, it was necessary for Yeshua to be redeemed according to the principle of Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn, as we have seen. We also know that his priesthood was on the basis of being of the special order of Melchizedek. That's exactly what Psalm 110 prophesied, and Hebrews 5:10 confirms about the Messiah. So he didn't have to be a Levitical priest. He was a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, that is probably a very, very small list of people that are of the order of Melchizedek. It's either 1 or 2, depending on who Melchizedek was in the book of Genesis. If it was actually Yeshua in a pre-incarnate appearance, then there's only 1 from the order of Melchizedek. If it was a human being, and it's debatable, then it would be just he and Yeshua. He was not a Levitical priest, but he was entitled to be a priest of great significance because of what God prophesied through the psalmist in Psalm 110 about the Son. So because he was of the order of Melchizedek, he could then carry out the great and final act of atonement in the heavenly tabernacle that we read about in the book of Hebrews. So was the Pidyon Haben, the redemption of Yeshua at the age of 1 month, then meaningless? The best way to answer that question is what? With another question. Namely, what actually was accomplished when a person transferred his right to serve at the earthly temple to a Levite? It gave that priest the right to offer sacrifice for you, to connect the dots between you and God by way of a substitute. You are giving the priest the right to do that for you in this act of the Pidyon Haben. In other words, Yeshua gave the Levitical priests the right to do sacrifices at the earthly temple while he retained the right to do the ultimate sacrifice at the heavenly temple according to the order of Melchizedek. It's amazing how God just makes us all fit together. But you see, there's a sadness to this. Tragically, the great sacrifice that the priests would offer regarding Yeshua was not for his benefit. It was for his death. Because they, in essence, offered up his life to God. And I'm going to show you how the scriptures bring that out in John chapter 11, beginning in verse 49. So this is a conversation that's going on among the council or the Sanhedrin. So these are the highest level priests in all of Israel, including Caiaphas, who's the high priest at that time. One of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all." He's talking to all these people that are assembled there. "Nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." Can you see what he's saying here? He's saying we're going to arrange for the death of this one for the betterment of the entire nation. Because he thought that they were doing this for God, to eliminate this blasphemer, to eliminate this false Messiah. And that is what God would have wanted. That's their thinking at this time. But here is what John writes under the inspiration of the Ruach, the Spirit. He says, "Now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Yeshua was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad." Earlier, we sang Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah. That's this concept that is right here. Paul writes about how we become one new man when we believe in Yeshua, whether we're ethnically Jewish or Gentile. So you see, although the motivations of Caiaphas, the high priest, were evil, his words were actually true. Yeshua did die as one man for the entire nation. And because of his sacrifice, not just the nation of Israel, but the people from all nations of the world do not have to perish eternally. Surely, Caiaphas and the other priests who condemned Israel did not have that in mind. But you see, God did. He had that in his plan all along, all the way back to the day in Numbers chapter 18, when Adonai put his plan into motion. When he had Yeshua go through the redemption of the firstborn, in essence, he gave the priest the right to take his life. That is how significant this moment is in history. This redemption of the firstborn, that is how significant it is to understand what this is all about. So by believing in Yeshua, who is the rightful Messianic king and the true high priest of God, and even the final sacrifice of all time, all wrapped up into one, we are given the assurance of the forgiveness of our sins and the blessed promise of everlasting life in the world to come. The priests who were appointed to redeem Yeshua ended up being the very ones who turned him into our Redeemer. This is an amazing concept. Instead of becoming a true substitute mediator on his behalf, they made him the substitute sacrifice on our behalf. And that tells me that they probably thought that they were acting according to their own pious will. This is what must be done for God. But in reality, he was just using them to be his instruments of the realization of his sovereign will. And that is just another example of the way that God takes the schemes of humanity and uses them for his purposes. I like to say he's very good about taking lemons and turning them into very tasty spiritual lemonade. And so we see that in a variety of places. For example, in the case of Joseph, when he said to his brothers who schemed to do him harm, "You meant evil against me. But God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." And so that theme then continues throughout the Bible, where we see God's handiwork by taking the sinful actions of human beings and turns them around in order to accomplish his purposes. That's an amazing indicator of God's sovereignty. So it is important for us to see how God does this over and over again. Of course, if you never study God's word, you will never come to recognize this. So I wanted to show you this today as a means of encouragement, that God is always on the throne, using the circumstances of this world to bring blessings to those who trust in him and bring glory to his name. So this is one of the fundamental principles that informs me how I live my life. When someone does something that causes harm, as I see it, to our congregation, yeah, it's frustrating in the moment, but I realize God will have the victory. He's having the victory right now, and he will again here in the future. Well, I want to leave you with one final thought for today. It is a promise that has been given by the prophet Zechariah. And it's a verse that is familiar to many of us. It's in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, when he's foretelling that when the Messiah returns, this will be the response of the Jewish people. Ready? I, that's speaking about Adonai, will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Okay, it's Jewish people. House of David is very clearly a reference to Israel. I will pour out on them the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look upon me whom they have pierced. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. And they will weep bitterly over him like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. Now, quite often when we read this verse, we tend to focus on the incredible recognition that when the Messiah returns, it will be very evident that he will have been pierced. And it is rightly so that we put that emphasis on that indicator right there. So we never want to discount the profound nature of that truth. But I want you to also to notice how the people will respond to when they see him, when they recognize him also as being a firstborn. Did you notice that in that verse? Or is this like something that was kind of in the background? It's like noise. You look at the first part. It is a picture of one who is beloved of the Father and will become beloved of the people. That's what, when you think about a firstborn, or any of your children for that matter, you know what that means, how you love them, how beloved they are. And if something tragic happens to a child, especially your first one that was ever born, how you would mourn and you would weep bitterly over that. I think you can put yourself in that sense. And some of our people, unfortunately, have experienced that. But it's more than that. It is a picture of recognizing Yeshua as the one who should have been priest and should have been the mediator between the Father and humanity, the one who should be acknowledged as having been carried out the necessary sacrificial act that covers sin. It will be a recognition that he is entitled as the firstborn, and that he actually did carry out, because of the evidence of his piercing, that he did become the sacrifice. It's amazing that the prophet would provide that detail for us. But this will be a recognition of no ordinary firstborn son, because unlike other common firstborn sons who share in the sinful nature that led to their loss of the privilege of serving as priest, Yeshua never sinned. He never lost the right to be our great high priest. Never lost it. And the blessing of this verse is that a day is coming when the people of Israel, the Jewish people, will finally recognize this and will acknowledge him for who he truly is. That he is the Messiah of Israel. He is the King of Israel. He is the greatest prophet of Israel. And he is the true high priest of Israel. And he is even the sacrifice itself. He is everything that is necessary in atonement, all wrapped up in one. Well, as I see it, we do not have to wait for that day when he's returned to make this acknowledgement. We all need to do that as soon as we have the opportunity. Why? None of us knows what tomorrow brings. Tomorrow could be too late, I dare say. Today is the best day to say from the heart, Yeshua is Lord. He is the one who died in my place because of my sins. And he is my Redeemer, the one who paid the privilege for me to be able to dwell in eternity. He paid the price. A lot more than 5 shekels of silver, I have to say. So that is how we can make great sense out of this very peculiar and intriguing practice of Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. It demonstrates how all details matter when it comes to fulfilling God's plan for this world and for us.